Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be reading some articles out of History magazine, and tonight's theme is three women from history. You can see first we're going to be talking about Jane Austen. And these articles were chosen by my channel members. They are Ruji, Pamela Bathgate, Laura Clatworthy, and all the happy squirrels. They're the ones that decided which articles I am going to read tonight. So if you would like to have a say in which articles out of History magazine that I choose each month, you can click the join button or look at the link in the description box to become a channel member. I've set it to the cheapest possible option. It is 99 US cents per month. And not only do you get to pick History magazine articles, but there's lots of other exclusive behind the scenes content, audio only content, and lots of other little goodies for you too. So, without further ado, let's get started. We're going to read about Jane Austen. Then we are going to read about Ada Lovelace. And then we're going to read about a woman you've probably never heard of, the lone woman of San Nicolas. So let's get into it. Jane Austen, Love and Marriage in Regency England. This article is mostly about life in this time period as seen through her works, but we're going to talk a lot about her personal life as well, since that's very interwoven to her books. Also, what is your favorite Jane Austen book? I'm pretty sure I've read all of them, and it's so cliche, but I think my favorite is Pride and Prejudice. I think it's the funniest, with Emma as a close second. That book's not very funny. It's very dark. But let me know in the comments. Let's get started. We have now another girl, a present plaything for her sister Cassie and future companion. She is to be Jenny, and it seems to me as if she would be as like Henry as Cassie is to Nettie. With these words, the Reverend George Austen announced the birth of his daughter Jane, the seventh of 8 children, 6 boys, 2 girls, born to his wife, Cassandra Lee. No one could have suspected that this baby, born in 1775 in Steventon, a small town in England, would become one of the most famous novelists of all time. She died at just 41 and now rests in Winchester Cathedral. Jane Austen's life was spent mainly in the domestic sphere, always living with immediate family and never working outside the home. She lived in Steventon in Hampshire for 25 years, except for brief stints at girls' schools, in the resort town of Bath, the port and naval station of Southampton, and finally Chawton. She lived through the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and much of George IV's regency. She never left southern England, died in Winchester, and never married, though she had more than one proposal. But through her acute powers of observation, Austen depicted English society of the period in delicious and often ironic detail. She focused on the dramas and genteel drawing rooms of the upper classes and members of the gentry in her 6 major novels. All of them place female characters center stage. With wit and keen insight, Austen highlights the enormous obstacles they faced in trying to secure even minimal independence. Life in Regency England did not encourage freedom of expression, and penalties for speaking against society's status quo were high. Women in particular lacked most legal protections, including owning property and making legal and financial decisions in their own names. In a uniquely insightful and subversive style, Austen's novels address these and many other social and political issues. Primogeniture, I've never heard of that word. Sounds like firstborn, primogeniture. Entailment and inheritance, royalty, wealth, poverty, and social class, adultery and illegitimacy, colonialism and slavery, and equal rights. Jane and her sister Cassandra received a brief formal education at boarding schools. In Austen's time, the purpose of educating genteel young women was to raise their stock in the marriage market. A young woman was more likely to land a decent marriage proposal if she possessed accomplishments. Some young ladies are educated in girls' schools, others at home with a governess, but most would learn to play a musical instrument, to draw, embroider, and dance, and to speak a polite smattering of French, considered a sophisticated language. Superficial studies in geography and history might be useful too, but only as a way of enlivening conversation. I've been here. Really cool place. Neat little museum inside. The people are really nice too that worked there. In her novel Emma, published in 1815, a year and a half before her death, Austen describes Mrs. Goddard's school as a real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price, and where girls might be sent to be out of the way and scramble themselves into a little education without any danger of coming back prodigies. At 17 or 18, or sometimes earlier, the daughters of upper-middle-class families were launched into society and the marriage market. For daughters of the aristocracy and some other privileged families, this included being presented to a member of the royal family at the court of St. James's in London. For less well-connected young women, coming out would mean attending a private party or a local dance. Once out, a young woman would attend an array of social events, walks, balls, and tea parties, all with the ultimate goal of meeting an eligible gentleman willing to make a marriage proposal. Inheritance issues. Such a proposal could be a lifeline for some women and their families. The fate of many was marked from birth by an inexorable law of inheritance. When a male head of household died, almost all his possessions were typically passed to his eldest son through entailment. If he had only daughters, legal conditions often came into play. A man's assets would skip over the family's women, inherited by the next male in the familial line, which could leave the deceased's immediate family with no income. In Pride and Prejudice, the Bennet family's estate is subject to such an entailment. When Mr. Bennet dies, Longbourn would pass not to his wife or 5 daughters, but to Mr. Collins, a distant cousin. Often women's only share of the family fortune was their marriage dowry. For so many women, marriage was the only way to achieve any material stability. Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice openly admits her plight in a difficult conversation with her friend Elizabeth Bennet when they discuss Mr. Collins's proposal. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state. Clinching the marriage deal among the gentry involved a transaction between the two families. The groom was expected to have the means to support his new wife, while the bride had to contribute the dowry put aside for her by her family. Lack of funds rather than changes in affection ended many relationships. In Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the first of her novels published in her lifetime, Marianne Dashwood falls in love with a handsome gentleman, John Willoughby, and he with her. However, Marianne has only a modest dowry. Following the revelation of Willoughby's involvement in a scandal, he is disinherited by his wealthy aunt, and ruthlessly abandons Marianne to marry a wealthy heiress. Securing a marriage proposal from the heir to a large estate would have been the dream of many young women in Austen's day. Such a match guaranteed economic and social position. Landing a member of the aristocracy with a title, privileges, and possessions was a bonus. Pride and Prejudice's Fitzwilliam Darcy is perhaps the best known of all the eligible gentlemen in Austen's novels. As the owner of an extensive Derbyshire family estate, his annual income is £10,000, which is the equivalent to more than $1 million today. While being the firstborn son usually meant inheriting the family estate, younger brothers needed to find themselves a profession. Manual trades are unthinkable for the upper classes and the gentry. Trade, though potentially lucrative, was seen as vulgar. A man might well become rich through it, but he would never be considered an equal by the members of the nobility. The only respectable career options for those who wanted to maintain social standing were the clergy, the law, or the armed forces. Traditionally, few who went into the military made a fortune that could compare with that of upper-class firstborn sons. But during the Napoleonic Wars, some did get rich, especially Navy officers who took a share in bounty looted from the French. In Austen's Persuasion, her protagonist, Anne Elliot, accepts a marriage proposal from Frederick Wentworth, a low-ranking seaman. Anne's associates force her to break off the engagement. 8 years later, Wentworth returns from war as a captain with a large fortune and finally marries Anne. Becoming a clergyman was another option for her second son. In Regency England, Anglican clergy were held in high regard and moved freely between social classes. With the right connections, ideally a patron from the aristocracy's upper echelons, a clergyman could obtain a parish or chaplaincy along with a home and a secure, if modest, income. Yet some young women remained skeptical about ecclesiastical suitors. In Austen's Mansfield Park, the third of Austen's novels to be published in her lifetime in 1814, Edmund Bertram, second son of a wealthy landowner, decides he will be ordained at 24 and run a parish on his father's land. Edmund is in love with charismatic Mary Crawford, who is unimpressed. "So you are to be a clergyman, Mr. Bertram? This is rather a surprise to me," she says. He replies, "Why should it surprise you? You must suppose me designed for some profession, and might perceive that I am neither a lawyer, nor a soldier, nor a sailor." But Mary's opinion is categorical. Men love to distinguish themselves, and in either of the other lines distinction may be gained, but not in the church. A clergyman is nothing. Given the transactional vision of marriage typical of the period, it is striking to some that in her novels and personal correspondence, Austen repeatedly defends marrying for love. "Oh, Lizzie, do anything rather than marry without affection," Jane Bennet pleads with her sister Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice. In her own life, Austen espoused the same beliefs. She wrote to her niece Fanny, "Nothing can be compared to the misery of being bound without love, bound to one and preferring another. That is a punishment which you do not deserve." In fact, several of Austen's protagonists do reject marriage proposals from wealthy gentlemen, even though they are being offered a life of luxury and comfort. Lizzie and Darcy. Taking a look at Austen's own life, it is tempting to see these instances as more than just romantic plot twists. She seems to have followed her own edict when she received a proposal of marriage from Harris Bigwither, brother of a dear friend and heir to Manydown Manor, Although Austen initially accepted the proposal, she turned it down the next day. For an author often mischaracterized as writing Regency romances, Austen always had a clear-eyed view of what marriage entailed and what she wanted. Austen and her sister remained unwed, a situation that she herself recognized as unenviable. As she wrote with her usual irony and wit in a letter to her niece Fanny, single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor, which is one very strong argument in favor of matrimony. Professional opportunities from a single genteel woman were quite limited, unless she had private means, through an inheritance or assistance from a family member. The most common field for such a woman to earn a living was either as a teacher in a girls' school or as a governess to gentry. This was Jane Fairfax's situation in Austen's Emma. A young woman of fine qualities, but without money or connections, she is forced to accept a job as a governess, remain single, and move away from home. Emma also introduces the unfortunate Miss Bates, a mature single woman who cares for her elderly mother. They subsist on the meager interest from savings left by the late Mr. Bates. As a clergyman's daughter, Miss Bates belongs to the gentry, but with such little income she depends on her neighbors to lead a decent life. Mr. Knightley, one of her main benefactors, describes Miss Bates's bleak situation in a pointed conversation with Emma. She is poor. She has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. Transcending circumstance. Jane Austen was a woman and a writer at a time when both circumstances posed challenges. Along with her mother and sister, Cassandra, she knew hardship and financial dependency after her father's death. They were forced to leave Steventon and were lacking a home of their own until Brother Edward offered them Chawton Cottage. However, rather than railing overtly against the social order and values of her time, Austen used keen observation to point out their shortcomings. She turned her curious, searching gaze on the people and situations around her, leaving her criticisms and raising social concerns subtly, with warmth, insight, and above all, humor. What interested her most were the individuals she shares with her readers, reflecting the range of personalities and attitudes found in her social circle. But her timeless observations of human character and the way of the world transcend any limitations of her place and time and have become classics. Sir Walter Scott praised Austen's exquisite touch, which renders ordinary, commonplace things and characters interesting, from the truth of the description and the sentiment. He went on to lament for all her readers, "What a pity such a gifted creature died so early." Isn't that true? Apparently this place inspired Pemberley, which is Mr. Darcy's estate in Pride and Prejudice. Very pretty. My goodness. Alright, let's stay in England for a bit and learn about another pioneering woman, Ada Lovelace, programming pioneer. Yes, programming, like computer programming. People call her the first programmer. She is so pretty. Let's read it. On a summer Monday evening in 1833, Ada Byron and her mother, Annabella Byron, went to the home of English mathematician Charles Babbage. 12 days earlier, when the younger Byron met Babbage at a high society soiree, she had been taken with his description of a machine he was building. The hand-cranked apparatus of bronze and steel used stacks of cogs, hammer-like metal arms, and thousands of numbered wheels to automatically solve mathematical equations. But the difference engine, as Babbage called it, was incomplete. He had finished a small prototype that stood about 2.5 feet tall. The clanging, whirring showpiece was able to spit out answers to challenging mathematical equations. Babbage believed the complete product had the potential to solve much more complex problems. The difference engine's demonstration piece set London's intellectual circles and scientific community alight, wowing the likes of Charles Darwin and Charles Dickens. Its performance was near miraculous, even to London's greatest intellects, an almost sorcerous parlor trick for Babbage. While the difference engine wasn't magical to 17-year-old Ada Byron, it was transformative. Upon seeing the machine on that fateful evening in 1833, she understood how it worked. In Ada, 41-year-old Babbage found his intellectual equal, and over the course of the next 2 decades, Ada would prove that her understanding and vision for such machines went far beyond mere calculation. An analytical childhood. Ada Lovelace was born Augusta Ada Byron on December 10th, 1815, into Victorian English high society. Her mother, Annabella Byron, was one of the few women of her generation to be afforded an education. She passed her love of knowledge, and mathematics in particular, onto her daughter, hiring famous mathematicians to tutor young Ada, and instructing Ada herself when she could not find a suitable tutor. It wasn't just the selfless pursuit of knowledge that led Annabella to ensure her daughter had the best education. Annabella was worried that too much unchecked imagination could bring out the influence of Ada's absentee father, the poet George Gordon Byron, better known to the world as Lord Byron. Described by one of his mistresses as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, Lord Byron was famous for his wordsmithery and infamous for his licentious and tortured public life. As a romantic era celebrity, his addiction and mental health struggles were visible for all to see. Annabella and he were briefly married, but when Ada was born, Byron was reportedly quite angry about the sex of the child. On a January morning in 1816, less than 5 weeks after Ada's birth, Annabella quietly gathered the baby and left for her parents' country home, moving them away from Byron and his influence. Within a matter of months, Lord Byron had left England for good. Ada, Byron's only child born in wedlock, never knew her father. He died when Ada was 8 years old. Intellectual equals. Lady Byron, fearful that Ada would inherit her father's self-destructive tendencies, nurtured her daughter's analytical side, and Ada's childhood passion for mathematics proved enduring. By the time Ada entered her late teens, her mother noted with wry pride that she was more interested in talking to scientists and mathematicians than potential suitors from England's elite. In 1835, Ada married William King, a member of the English nobility. He soon became the Earl of Lovelace, giving Ada the title Countess of Lovelace. The two shared a love of horses, and her husband appears to have supported Ada's intellect and thirst for knowledge. Perhaps Ada's most fruitful relationship was her lifelong friendship with Charles Babbage. That works. On an evening together in 1834, Babbage explained to Ada and her mother an idea he had for another invention. Although the difference engine, that clanging hand-cranked machine he had demonstrated for Ada the previous year, remained unfinished, Babbage was already envisioning a machine more complicated and more capable. It would be powered by steam, and its spinning wheels would take up as much space as a locomotive. He called the imagined machine the analytical engine, and it would be able to do more than simple math. Instead, it would be able to eat its own tail. In Babbage's words, which meant that the machine could store its outposts and then employ them in other equations. In essence, this machine would not just calculate, it would compute. Fascinated with the invention and its potential, Lovelace stayed in close communication with Babbage as he developed the machine's schematics. In 1842, Italian mathematician and future Prime Minister Luigi Federico Menabrea published a paper on Babbage's proposed machine, which Lovelace eagerly translated into English in hopes of drumming up more support for the invention in England. She signed her translation only as A.A.L. Along with the translated article, Lovelace submitted her own notes on the analytical engine. Her translator's note dwarfed the translated article itself, clocking in at well over double Menabrea's word count. In the notes, Lovelace included her own explanation of how the hypothetical machine would work, expressed in considerably greater detail than Menabrea's original paper. Lovelace explained that the machine would function similarly to the Jacquard loom, an invention that had transformed the textile industry in the 19th century. The loom used a series of punch cards to partially automate the mechanical production of woven patterns and images. Rather than a person manipulating certain threads to create a pattern, the presence or absence of a punch on the card automatically told the loom which threads to raise, creating complex designs in a mere fraction of the time. The cards were a sort of binary code, and the analytical engine, too, would run on punch cards. The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves, Lovelace wrote. Perhaps the most influential of her notes was titled Note G. In this note, she wrote a detailed description of how punch cards could be used in the analytical engine to output a long sequence of Bernoulli numbers, a series of rational numbers that recur throughout mathematics. Her note converted a mathematical calculation into a series of instructions that could be executed by the analytical engine. With this note, Lovelace had written the first computer program for a machine that did not even exist and was known only by description. Poetical science. Lovelace's vision for the device went far beyond just the ability to calculate complex equations. In her notes, she argued that anything that could be represented by numbers, such as musical notes and letters, could also be manipulated by such machines. She foresaw an age in which people worked collaboratively with such machines. Her vision for these devices went far beyond the ideas of Babbage himself, who believed the machine's usefulness would stop at computation. In her work, Lovelace balanced her mother's analytical rigor and her father's whimsy. She published detailed, concrete descriptions of how a hypothetical computer would function, while writing poetically about the potential of a mechanized future. Her mathematical intellect, paired with her creativity, allowed her to envision an abstract field that came to be known as computing. She called her own work poetical science. Lovelace died of uterine cancer in 1852 at just 36 years old. She never saw the analytical engine completed. In fact, the machine has never been built. Babbage completed only a small piece of the analytical engine before his death in 1871. But in 1979, well over 100 years after Lovelace wrote the first computer program, a computing language used in transportation and military systems worldwide was named Ada in her honor. So cool. So the last story we're going to read tonight is about, let me flip there, the lone woman of San Nicolas Island. And the background tonight is my home state of California, so I can kind of show you. I think they're just off screen. I'm going to move the page up a bit. So here is Los Angeles and Southern California, right? Over here are the Channel Islands. And here you can just see, oh my gosh, let me try that. There we go. The Channel Islands here. That's San Nicolas Island right there. That's where we're going tonight. So, let's read about the lone woman of San Nicolas Island. When otter hunters returned to Santa Barbara from California's most remote coastal island in 1853, they carried more than cargo and a diverse crew. Also aboard was a 50-year-old woman, a passenger who spoke a language they could not understand. More astounding, she apparently had spent 18 years alone on the island. A striking romantic figure, the woman soon became an object of national fascination and romantic speculation, fueling tales of a surviving castaway. Undoubtedly, a correspondent wrote, she is the last of her race. Nameless, silent, courageous, her story had all the makings of a fascinating historical yarn, and inspired not just lengthy newspaper articles, but also Scott Odell's Newbery Medal-winning Island of the Blue Dolphins, a staple of elementary school curricula nationwide, and my favorite book when I was 10. I read it in school. I was obsessed with it. But the details of the lone woman's life, historians and archaeologists are now discovering, were built on a foundation of shifting sand. Today's scholars believe that nearly everything they thought about the enigmatic figure was wrong, and that the lone woman was anything but alone. Channel Islands castaway. About 60 miles off the California coast in chilly waters, San Nicolas Island is the most remote of the Channel Islands, an archipelago with a tormented history of indigenous use and environmental exploitation. Today, 5 of the 8 islands make up the Channel Islands National Park, but San Nicolas is used for weapons testing by the U.S. Navy. In the 19th century, it was home to the Nicoleño, Native Americans who had inhabited it for thousands of years. The secluded, dune-covered island was largely ignored by early European explorers, who did little more than name it. In the early 19th century, though, that changed, and so did the fate of its roughly 300 native inhabitants. Beginning in 1814, Russian otter hunters landed on San Nicolas in search of valuable furs. Mayhem ensued. Contemporary documents suggest that in retaliation for the murder of one of the hunters, the group massacred up to 90% of the Nicoleño. When in 1835 the remaining Nicoleño boarded a schooner for Los Angeles, the island's abundant otter population had been hunted nearly to extinction. The Nicoleño had left their ancestral home, but one remained, cut to 1853, when newspaper accounts of the discovery of a female Robinson Crusoe began to flood out of California. After years of rumors that someone still lived on the island, an American-led trapping expedition found and rescued a resourceful woman in a greenish cormorant feather skirt. She had lived in both a whalebone hut and a cave, and subsisted on island wildlife, seal blubber, plant bulbs, abalone, birds. Though the woman apparently enjoyed her new life in an adobe home in Santa Barbara, her trip to the mainland was lonely too. The communication barriers seemed insurmountable, and mainland diseases took their toll. She died within 7 weeks of her rescue. Before her death, a Catholic missionary christened her Juana Maria. That story, one of wild solitude, natural beauty, native grit, and the tragic fate of the noble savage, caught the attention of author Scott Odell, whose 1960 Island of the Blue Dolphins is based on the story. The book fictionalized the lone woman as a resilient teenager, Karana, creating a portrait of a girl's coming of age in the face of overwhelming difficulty. Fact-finding. It would seem there's no more to learn about the woman who, stranded by herself on her home island, hunted, fished, and withstood the elements as her people died out. But recent research suggests there's more, much more to the story. In the 20th century, archaeologists began to return to San Nicolas in search of more information about Juana Maria and her people. They would find up to 500 archaeological sites on the island. Some, like the remnants of a whalebone hut, do appear to be linked to the lone woman herself, while others provide more documentation of the rich history of the Nicoleño. Still others refute nearly every dramatic highlight of Juana Maria's supposed solitary life on San Nicolas Island. Independent historical researcher Susan Morris fell in love with the lone woman in 4th grade after she read Island of the Blue Dolphins in school. I was completely inspired by her lessons of courage and resourcefulness, she says. Morris is one of a team of researchers who had spent years dismantling the myths and misunderstandings that still surround the lone woman's place in history. Despite previous scholarship and abundant secondary sources, says Morris, it was clear 19th century chroniclers had bypassed a variety of sources. The hunters who visited San Nicolas, the native people who interacted with the lone woman during the last months of her lifetime, the missionaries who baptized her, the island's archaeological record, the Nicoleño themselves. Their motivations are lost to time, but one suspects the compelling tale of a lone castaway might have clouded their collective judgment. When taken into account, those historical sources reveal a very different story. The team traced the Nicoleño who left the island in 1835 and learned that at least 7 of them had settled in Los Angeles, where they thrived. At least one of them, dubbed Tomas, outlived the lone woman, disproving the romantic portrayal of her being the last of her tribe. Claims that no one could communicate with her were inaccurate, too. Linguists have now traced the 4 remaining words of her dialect to the Takic linguistic branch. Santa Barbara's native population spoke Chumash, which explains their difficulty understanding her attempts to communicate with them. Eventually, the woman did manage to speak with people who could comprehend her. She was trying to share her story, Morris said in a 2018 lecture. That story, it turns out, was wildly misinterpreted by the white men who took the lone woman to Santa Barbara. When found, she used gestures to tell her tale, emphatic hand movements that they thought showed she had stayed on the island because of a lost infant who was later eaten by wild dogs. But when Morris and her colleagues consulted notes by ethnologist John Peabody Harrington, who interviewed some native Californians about the tale in the late 19th century, they found she had actually stayed on the island with her son, who hid from the newcomers that arrived to take the Nicoleño to mainland California. For years, the pair thrived together on the island. The mother only left San Nicolas after her son's tragic death, in what historians think may have been a shark attack. Today, scholars are still learning more about the vibrant cultures that thrived on California's Channel Islands. The Chumash are believed to have lived on mainland California, in addition to 4 of the Channel Islands, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, San Miguel, and Anacapa. The southern Channel Islands of Santa Barbara, Santa Catalina, and San Clemente are linked to the Tongva people, also known as the Gabrieleño, the name Spanish missionaries called them, who may have been culturally linked to the Nicoleno. The search for more information on the lone woman continues. Morris and colleagues have turned their attention to the Nicoleno of Los Angeles, where they're searching for living descendants of the tribe. It's a chance, she says, to both honor the lone woman and acknowledge Native Californians' resilience despite repeated colonization and denigration. They lived on the land for thousands of years. They continue to live today. Perhaps further research will reveal more about what happened to the lone woman's people long after her death, exploding yet another myth born on that lonely, windswept island. So that will be it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this style of content, please consider subscribing. And if you're interested in being the one to pick which articles I read in the future, click that join button right down there. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a good